As military historian for Carleton County, I'm going to give you the next presentation of the World War II timeline. We're actually going 5 months ahead. Dieppe, August 19th, 1942. Over 6,050 infantry, predominantly Canadian, supported by a regiment of tanks, were put ashore from a naval force operating under the protection of the Royal Air Force. We lost a lot of people. This was to be a test to see how thick and how strong the German lines were. But it also had another top secret mission. This is the Dieppe Raid. The Dieppe Raid, or Operation Jubilee as it was codenamed, was launched as Stalin believed that the Western Allies were not carrying their fair share of the burden of the war, and so demanded that a second front be opened to draw German forces away from Russia. The United States, which had just recently joined the war following the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, also thought it best to launch and expedite a direct attack on the mainland Europe. The British High Command, particularly Prime Minister Winston Churchill, was acutely aware of these political pressures. The Dieppe Raid occurred under the auspices of the Combined Operations Headquarters, or COHQ, which was responsible for conducting British raiding operations. The COHQ's objective was to try to capture a port during this raid, hold it for a short period of time, and then withdraw quickly. As you can see here, this is a map of just of the German the German domination of Europe in 1942, and this is in August 1942. So we want to what the Allies want to do is exploit the Atlantic Wall, and Dieppe is where it's going to happen. And this is a test, but it's also a cover for another major mission. The major major contingent in the raid was composed of soldiers from Canada's 2nd Infantry Division. Originally, COHQ's planners had wanted the British Marine Division to carry out the raid, but political pressure from Canadians at home and several senior Canadian officers in Britain, particularly Lieutenant General Harry Carrera, resulted in the job being offered to Canada, my country. This pressure arose from a belief that the Canadian Army stationed in Britain was not playing an active role in winning the war, despite the fact that this army was being purposefully preserved so that it could play a major role in the ultimate Allied invasion of France. Canada would eventually play a crucial part on D-Day, as it had when it was assigned one of the 5 landing beaches. Canada's role in World War II, of course, the first major land combat action for Canada in World War II was at Hong Kong, and of course Canada had been involved in the Battle of the Atlantic since early part of the war, and of course during the Battle of Britain. So naval and air forces had seen much of the action for Canada up until Hong Kong, and of course Canada's role in World War II is still not generally well known in Western Europe, or even by its allies, the British and the Americans. This is despite the fact that Canada declared war on Germany, and that was September 10th, 1939, just a week after Britain and far earlier than the United States, as an independent nation, rather than as a member of the Commonwealth. Moreover, not only did it have the 3rd largest Western Allied army, with more than 150,000 soldiers as part of the 1st Canadian Army, it was the only army during World War II serving overseas that consisted entirely of volunteers. Only in the final days of the war were a handful of soldiers conscripted and saw combat. Canada also had the 3rd largest Air Force and Navy by the end of the war. Dieppe was selected due to its proximity to the United Kingdom and in relation to mainland Europe. It was the only French port close enough to Britain that Allied air forces could provide continuous coverage for the duration of the raid in sufficient strength to disrupt inevitable Luftwaffe efforts to strike the raiding ships. Beyond that, Dieppe had no strategic value. It was a minor port of limited use to the German Navy. Planning of the raid was extensive, but also fatally flawed. The beaches were unsuitable for landing tanks and major forces due to their cobbled nature. German defenses were thought to be less than they were, and the quality of the German soldiers underestimated. Ultimately, the raiders barely got off the beaches, and the casualties suffered rendered it the most tragic and bloodiest day for Canada of the Second World War. Much of the Royal Canadian Navy and, of course, the Royal Navy itself were doing their best. And of course, now that America has entered the war, um, you have U-boats going offshore of the United States as well, long range Type 9s and then forth, that are hitting U.S. and Allied tankers, just like they had been doing off of England. And the convoy system is also coming from the United States, New York, and others, as well as from Halifax now over to England. This is one of the many tankers. Looks like a either a T2 tanker that was torpedoed by a German U-boat in the Battle of the Atlantic. They were still in 1942, mid 42. They were losing thousands upon thousands of tons of ships, shipping, and the Allies were getting better. As I mentioned in the last presentation, they were getting better at sinking German subs, finding them with Aztec, and had better and deeper depth charges that go deeper than 90 meters. Allied shipping was crucial, and that including troop ships, with our contingent of forces from the 1st and 2nd Canadian Armies and onward. The Battle of the Atlantic was still raging when the final hours of preparation of the Dieppe Raid were being put together. In early August, late July and early August, the German forces at Dieppe were on high alert, having been warned by French double agents that the British were showing interest in the area. They had also detected increased radio traffic and landing craft being concentrated in the southern British coastal ports. Here you can see a machine gun nest at MG34 medium machine gun emplacement, Mauser ammunition, 500 or 900 rounds a minute. For the assault troops, General Bernard Montgomery chose the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division for the raid. General Andrew McNaughton, who commanded the 1st Canadian Army, and General H.D.G. Carrier, commander of I Canadian Corps, 1 Canadian Corps, eagerly accepted this opportunity for Canadian soldiers to get some combat experience, as they had been stationed in Great Britain for 2 years without having ever engaged the enemy in a major operation. In Canada, public opinion was starting to question this inactivity. The time was ripe, and Canadian soldiers were roaring to go and make a name for themselves like their predecessors of the First World War. Our participation at Dieppe are as follows: the 14th Army Tank Regiment, the Calgary Regiment tanks, which landed with Churchill heavy tanks, the Black Watch Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, the Calgary Highlanders, the Corps of Royal Canadian Engineers, the Essex Scottish Regiment, Les Fusiliers de Mont Royal, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada, and the Royal Canadian Air Force. Other units included were Royal Canadian Corps of Signals, Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps, Canadian Intelligence Corps, Royal Canadian Ordnance Corps, Canadian Provost Corps, Royal Canadian Army Service Corps. So the pressure was on from the Soviets, at least to relieve pressure from the east and divert attention to the west. The Allies were not ready to launch an assault, but did want to test new equipment and gather intelligence. Allied leaders decided the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division should spearhead a raid on Dieppe, a French seaport on the English Channel. Since June 1941, the Nazis had been pushing deeper into the Soviet Union. So now over a year of this going on, the now you have, of course, the summer push, the spring and then summer push of the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union. The Nazi-Soviet war on the Eastern Front was very vicious and ruthless. It was the war of annihilation, and thousands of Soviets were dying daily. The Russians were losing hope and urged the British and the Allies to open up a second front in Western Europe and draw away a lot of the Nazi army and relieve pressure on the Soviet army. The 2nd Canadian Division would be selected for the taking on the challenges. This battle, this raid, was a pivotal moment in the Second World War, certainly for Canada. With virtually all of continental Europe under German occupation, the Allied forces faced a well-entrenched enemy. Some method had to be found to create a foothold on the continent, and the raid on Dieppe offered invaluable lessons for the successful D-Day invasion in 1944, saving countless lives in that momentous offensive. Canadians made up the great majority of the attackers in the raid. So over 5,000 or nearly 5,000 of the 6,050 to 6,100 troops were Canadians. The remaining troops consisted of approximately 1,000 British commandos and 50 American Rangers. The raid was supported by 8 Allied destroyers and 74 Allied air squadrons, 8 belonging to the Royal Canadian Air Force. Major General J. H. Roberts, commander of the 2nd Canadian Division, was military force commander with Captain J. Hughes Howlett, Royal Navy. The Royal Navy as Naval Force Commander and Air Vice Marshal T. L. Leigh Mallory as Air Force Commander. This raid came at a price. 916 Canadians lost their lives. Out of all of that, more than 3,350 Canadians became casualties. At least over 2,000 were wounded, and about 1,950 more were taken prisoner. A total of 210 British and American personnel also lost their lives. Many factors contributed to the decision to mount a large raid into occupied Europe in 1942. Soviet Union, of course, pressuring the Allies to open a second front. The Allies, however, needed more time to build up their military resources before undertaking such a massive effort. They felt that a large raid on the coast of France, however, could force the Germans to divert more of their military resources away from the Soviet Union and also help in the planning for the full-scale Allied assault that would eventually have to take place. Canadian soldiers had been training since the outset of the war in 1939, and except for the Battle of Hong Kong, had yet to see significant action. That's our army. There was political pressure at home to finally get the Canadians into battle, as well as impatience within the army itself. Dieppe it's a resort town situated at a break in the cliffs along the northwest coast of France, and was selected as the main target of the raid, partially because it was within range of fighter planes from Great Britain and consistent Allied air power for a consistent amount of time. The Allies' plan was to launch a large-scale amphibious landing, damage enemy shipping and port facilities, and gather intelligence on German defenses and radar technology. Recent research has suggested that the desire to capture a top-secret Enigma code machine and accompanying code books was also an important factor in mounting this raid, a major factor. The Allied situation in the spring of 1942 was grim. The Germans had penetrated deep into Russia. The British Eighth Army in North Africa had been forced back into Egypt. and in Western Europe, the Allied forces had been pushed across the English Channel to Britain. At this point, the Allied forces weren't strong enough to mount Operation Overlord, the full scale invasion of Western Europe. Instead, the Allies decided to mount a major raid, and that was in Dieppe. It was designed to test new equipment and gain the experience and knowledge necessary for planning a great amphibious assault that would one day be necessary to defeat Germany and the German Atlantic Wall. Also, after years of training in Britain, some Canadian politicians and generals, as we mentioned, definitely anxious to get this on the go. As stated by the commander of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, which was Major General um, J.H. Roberts, he stated, "Don't worry, men, it'll be a piece of cake." A comment that would haunt him for years afterwards. Dieppe and the flanking cliffs were well defended. The 1,500-strong garrison from the 302nd Static Infantry Division comprised the 570th, 571st, and 572nd Infantry Regiments, each of 2 battalions, the 302nd Artillery Regiment, the 302nd Reconnaissance Battalion, and the 302nd Anti-Tank Battalion, the 302nd Engineer Battalion, and 302nd Signal Battalion. They were deployed along the beaches of Dieppe and the neighboring towns, covering all the likely landing places. The city and port were protected by a concentration of heavy weapons on the main approach, particularly in the mirrored cliff caves, and with a reserve at the rear. The defenders were stationed not only in the towns themselves, but also between the towns in open areas and highlands that overlooked the beaches. Elements of the 571st Infantry Regiment defended the Dieppe radar station near Pourville and the artillery battery over the Sai River at Varennes. To the east, the 570th Infantry Regiment were deployed near the artillery battery at Berneville-le-Grand. And here's Varennes, and here's Berneville-le-Grand, Pourville. Planners of the Dieppe raid feared that unjustifiable civilian losses would anger the further alienate the Vichy government, puppet government in Lower France, an unattractive option considering the intent of Operation Torch. Not 3 months later, Major General Roberts, the military force commander, is also said to have argued that a bombardment would make the town streets impassable, and thus hinder the assault after it had broken out of the beaches. The Canadian officers planning the assault believed that the combination of speed, surprise, and sheer shock caused having tanks come ashore with the infantry would be enough to carry the day. General C. Churchill Mann, who was regarded as the most able staff officer in the Canadian Army, wrote that the entire concept of landing tanks onto the shoreline of France is almost a fantastic conception, and that what would be gained via surprise and the terrific moral efforts on the Germans and the French would be more than enough to ensure the success of Operation Rudder, as the raid was then codenamed. So, to achieve these goals, plans were made for a large scale raid to take place in July 1942, and that was Operation Rudder. Canadians would provide the main assault force, and by May 20th, troops of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division were on the Isle of Wight in the English Channel, training intensively in amphibious operations. Poor weather in July, however, prevented them from launching Operation Rudder. Many involved in the planning wanted to abandon the raid. Despite the debate, the operation was revived and given the new code name Jubilee. The port of Dieppe on the French coast remained the objective. The Dieppe landings were planned on 6 beaches, 4 in front of the town itself, and 2 to the eastern and western flanks, respectively. From east to west, the beaches were codenamed Yellow, Blue, Red, White, Green, and Orange. Number 3 Commando would land on Yellow Beach, the Royal Regiment of Canada on Blue. The main landings would take place on Red and White Beaches by the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Essex Scottish Regiment, the Fusiliers Le Mont Royal, a Commando Royal Marines, and the Armour, the South Saskatchewan Regiment, and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada would land on Green Beach, and number 4 Commando on Orange. Armored support was provided by the 14th Army Tank Regiment, the Calgary Regiment tank, with 58 of the new Churchill tanks to be delivered using the new landing craft, the landing craft tank (LCT). The tanks had a mixture of armament with QF 2-pounder guns, armed tanks fitted with close support howitzer in the hull, operating alongside a QF 6-pounder. So QF 6-pounder armed tanks as well. In addition, 3 of the Churchills were equipped with flamethrower equipment, and all had adaptations enabling them to operate in the shallow water near the beach. The Royal Navy supplied 237 ships and landing craft. However, pre-landing naval gunfire support was limited, consisting of 6 Hunt-class destroyers with 4-inch 100mm guns. This was because of the reluctance of First Sea Lord Sir Dubley Pond to risk capital ships in an area he believed vulnerable to attacks by German aircraft. Montbellon asked Pound to send a battleship in to provide fire support for the Dieppe Raid, but Pound was mindful that the Japanese aircraft had sunk the battlecruiser HMS Repulse and the battleship HMS Prince of Wales off Malaya in December 1941, and he would not risk sending capital ships into waters where the Allies did not have absolute air superiority. The Royal Air Force provided 74 squadrons of aircraft, of which 66 were fighter squadrons. Things immediately went wrong for the landing force, certainly on the eastern flank. They encountered a small German convoy, and the ensuing firefight alerted the enemy. The soldiers that came ashore at Berneval and Puys consequently were met with overwhelming fire, and some of the heaviest Allied losses took place there. Some objectives on the western flank were achieved, and the enemy gun batteries at Verneuil were destroyed. In Pourville, the South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders came ashore and pushed towards their goals. The mounting German resistance, however, would force them to withdraw with heavy losses. The initial landings began at 0450 on August 19th, with attacks on the artillery batteries on the flanks of the main landing area. These were Varengaville, Saint Marguerite-sur-Mer, known as Orange Beach by number 4 Commando, Pourville, Green Beach by the South Saskatchewan Regiment, and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada at Puys, Blue Beach by the Royal Regiment of Canada, and Berneval, Yellow Beach by number 3 Commando. On their way in, the landing craft and escorts heading towards Puys and Berneval ran into the exchange fire with a small German convoy, and that's at 0348. The Allied destroyers HMS Brooklesby and ORP Sozek noticed the engagement, but their commanders incorrectly assumed that the landing craft had come under fire from the shore batteries. It did not come to their rescue. Red and White Beaches, preparing the ground for the landings, 4 destroyers were bombarding the coast as landing craft approached. At 0515, they were joined by 5 Royal Air Force Hurricane squadrons, who bombed the coastal defenses and set a smokescreen to protect the Allied troops. Between 0330 and 0340, 30 minutes after the initial landings, the main frontal assault by the Essex Scottish and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry started. Their infantry were their infantry was meant to be supported by Churchill tanks of the 14th Army Tank Regiment, landing at the same time, but the tanks arrived on the beach late. Running behind schedule, the main force going ashore at Dieppe landed as daylight was breaking. The German troops, now alerted to the raid, cut down many Canadians as they waded in the surf. Nevertheless, many of our soldiers fought their way across the cobblestone beach to the relative protection of the seawall. The same cobblestones and seawall made it hard for the Allied tanks to move off the beach, and the fierce enemy fire prevented engineers from clearing the way for them to push their way into the town. Small groups from the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Essex Scottish Regiment were able to fight their way into the bullet-swept streets of Dieppe. It was clear, however, that the raid could not continue, and the retreat soon began. Trying to evacuate everyone, however, would mean the probable destruction of the Allied naval force. Though great courage, many men were taken off the beaches under heavy fire, but by early afternoon the last boat had departed. Left in a hopeless situation, the remaining Canadians were forced to surrender. The raid was over. For intelligence on the area was sparse. There were dug-in German gun positions on the cliffs, but these had not been detected or spotted by air reconnaissance photographers, and that was also part of the problem. The planners had assessed the beach gradient and its suitability for tanks only by scanning holiday snapshots, which led to an underestimation of the German strength and of the terrain. It was certainly more problematic. The outline plan for Operation Rudder, and then Operation Jubilee, which, although never executed, but Operation Jubilee became the basis for Operation Jubilee. And of course, this is the raid being over now. We can, of course, many over 80 years ago. We're looking at everything now as so much has happened, and yet so many mistakes were made. Lack of intelligence, lack of consistent intelligence, and of course, the Germans being tipped off by French collaborators. It's all one and numerous other things. Of the nearly 5,000 strong contingent that was Canadian, 3,367 were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. We lost 913 dead. It was an exceptional casualty rate of 68%. The Royal Navy lost one destroyer, HMS Berkeley, and 33 landing craft, suffering 550 dead and wounded. RAF lost 106 aircraft to the 48 lost by the Luftwaffe. The German army had suffered 591 casualties. Of the 50 U.S. Army Rangers serving with different commando units, 6 were killed, 7 wounded, and 4 captured. While the Canadian contingent fought bravely in the face of a determined enemy, it was ultimately circumstances outside their control which sealed their fate. Despite criticism concerning the inexperience of the Canadian regiment that was engaged in battle, scholars have noted that even seasoned professionals would have been having a hard-pressed time under the deplorable conditions brought about by their superiors. The commanding officers who designed the raid on Dieppe had not envisaged such losses. They have not envisioned this. This was, after all, one of the first attempts by the Western Allies on a German-held port city. As a consequence, planning from the highest ranks in preparation for the raid was minimal. Critical strategic and tactical errors were made, which resulted in scores of Allied, and particularly our Canadian, deaths and captures. The commandos, they're specifically British troops and specially trained Two British commando groups were to attack in a cover operation. They were to attack opposite ends of Dieppe. Number 3 commandos attacked east of Dieppe in a town called Berneval, and the number 4 commandos attacked west of Dieppe in a city called Varngavel. Before the attack on Berneval, the ships carrying the number 3 met a German convoy and skirmish ensued. When the number 3 finally reached Berneval, the Germans were ready and most of them were captured because they were outnumbered. About 20 people managed to reach the guns but did not destroy them. Their mission was to take out some of these coastal guns. Number 30 Commandos Unit were able to get their hands on an Enigma decoding device that would help decipher German codes for the Allied war effort, and that would be the U-boat Enigma codes. This was a four-rotor Enigma coding machine. These were four-rotor coding Enigma machines, coding books and rotor settings. This machine was new. The Allies needed it critically for decoding the U-boat messages from the Kriegsmarine headquarters to German U-boat commanders. Number 30 Assault Unit Commandos was led by Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming. The presence of all the other troops was to provide distraction for number 30 unit as it attempted to reach German headquarters that was located at the Hotel Moderne. The objective was to capture the machine and associated parts for cryptoanalysts and Bletchley Park to assist with Project Ultra, which we know all too well now. At Bletchley Park, and Alan Turing with his decoding machine that he was creating at the time. All plays a part in it. Ian Fleming in room 3 of the Admiralty during the Second World War. That's Ian Fleming. These 5 points on the Dieppe raid took place that morning. They were attacking on 5 different points on a roughly 16 kilometers long stretch. And the German batteries, the Hess battery had 650 millimeter guns, Mobile battery 400 millimeter field howitzers, Goring battery 400 millimeter howitzers, Hitler battery 450 millimeter howitzers, Rommel battery 400 millimeter, and another 6 mobile battery 400 millimeter field howitzers, and Goebbels battery 370 millimeter guns and 105 guns. And of course, 8 and 9 batteries were heavy anti-aircraft batteries. So they had a heavy amount of firepower there as well. The British commandos that were assigned to destroy the coastal batteries at Berneval, about 20 guys met up with those guns, but they were not able to destroy much of these guns, if any. And of course, Canadians, we were part of the half an hour launching the main thrust of an attack on the town of Dieppe itself, and the frontal attack, in which was very, very deadly. That's where the first contingent lost the most amount of men, and they also went in at gaps at the cliffs at Pourville, 4 kilometers to the west, and at Poise to the east. Where my mouse is here, that's Poise to the east, as Pourville here to the west. Varennes-Saumur here, and you can see here at Saint Aubin is there. You can see, and then that's Dieppe, the main section of Dieppe here. So that's orange 2, orange 1, green, white, red, and blue here. And these are the units that are going in through. Where the tanks are, and of course the tanks they're white and red, and that's where we lost the most amount of people. Number 3 commandos attacked on yellow 1 and yellow 2 here. And the four commandos, of course, on this side here, sent Margaret orange one, orange two. Our main service rifles, of course, were the Lee Enfield number 4 Mark Ones. They carry two 5-round clips, internal clips, or can be loaded via magazine in the bottom as well. The bolt action, roughly maximum around 1,000 yards, five 600. That's maximum 5 600 or so respectively. But these are long shooting rifles. They're great. 303 British. You can see the Piat anti-tank system here. That's an anti-tank grenade system. Um, these were carried by Canadians in the Second World War as well as British. Uh, some of our commandos have the Sten Mark IIs, a 9 millimeter submachine gun, and the helmets and uniforms. These are the pattern 37 uh, combat uniforms, and of course some of them you have the commandos. Some will have the beret instead of the helmets. Those the newer helmets that were coming out were the Turtle Mark III helmets that were coming out. Most of the soldiers, a lot of them still have the Mark II, some early Second World War. PIAT stands for Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, or PIAT. Mark I is a British man-portable anti-tank weapon. It was designed in 1942, so it was new. And of course, it entered service in 1943. And so, if any of them had these, they were very, very new. Um, and they were produced from pretty much August 1942 onward. And there was about 115,000 of these built. Um, so these would the grenade would have has a it's a detonation mechanism that's an impact, so it has to impact the target. It's a spigot mortar is what it's designed at. So its maximum firing range is 350 yards. Effective firing rounds roughly about 115 yards, and that's the system here, the Piat. So that would have been produced starting around the time of the Dieppe Raid, and then much onward, and used much more afterwards because it wasn't really in service much until 43. Our biggest tanks that were being used, the Churchill Mark IIs. The Churchill Mark II was the most numerous of the 2-pounder versions of the Churchill infantry tank. The Churchill Mark I was armed with a 2-pounder gun and a coaxial Besa machine gun in a small cast turret and a 3-inch howitzer in the hull in the front. Late in 1940, it was discovered that the supply of howitzers was running short, and so most early Churchills were completed as Mark IIs, which carried a second Besa machine gun in the hull front instead. It retained the small cast turret with a 2-pounder gun and coaxial machine gun. The Churchill 1 was originally built with exposed tracks and air intake lures on the hull sides. During the long reworking program, most were later given track covers and had the air intakes moved from the side to the top to prevent them from getting clogged. The new type could also take a trunk to allow the tank to wade through deeper water. And so that was the Churchill was one major test, um, authorized for the Dieppe Raid. Another one was, of course, the universal carriers, which were newer as well. Universal carrier, of course, is small. It's lightly armored. It's a tankette, so it's a like a tank. It's armored like that, but it's a tankette, which means it has no top. It's open topped, fully tracked, and it's used mainly throughout the Second World War, even in the early Cold War. But there were several models utilized, including both 6 and 8 bogey wheel versions. The first is the Mark Ones. The Mark Twos were more plentiful. All vehicles listed below were sometimes uh, colloquially referred to as Bren gun carriers. Due to the main armament of the earliest versions used in the British Army and Canadian Army who developed the vehicle. Of course, the Carlton York Regiment, they had these, and they had them in medium machine gun variants and regular Bren gun carriers. So you'd have a Bren gun in reserve, and then you'd have one equipped Bren gun on the top, or in the reticle here, uh, in the machine gun position here. And some would actually also be equipped with a Boys anti-tank rifle, which is basically it's a heavy material, like a sniper rifle, but it's an anti-material rifle. Canada produced, and these were used and tested in Dieppe as well, I believe. Canada produced nearly 860,000 of these from September 1st, 39 to September 1st, 1945. Included in this was the total of 28,992 universal carriers, which is 3.37% of the total, and 5,000 Windsor carriers, 0.58% of the total. These figures include models for export in addition to those actually utilized by Canadian troops. And this is one of my scratch built models. This is a Mark II Bren gun carrier used by the 1st Canadian Division. And this would be the Carlton York Regiment, or or connected with that, the Royal Canadian Rangers. The Daimler Dingo. Known as one of the finest armored fighting vehicles built in Britain during the war, the Dingo was a compact two-man armored car, uh, well protected for its size, with 1.2 inch 30 millimeters of armor at the front, and powered by a 2.5 liter 55 horsepower 41 kilowatt straight 6 petrol engine in the rear of the vehicle. An ingenious feature of the Dingo's design was the transmission, which included a pre-selector gearbox and fluid flywheel that gave 5 speeds in both directions. Another was a four-wheel steering system, made possible by the H-drive drivetrain of the vehicle. Given a tight turning cycle of 23 feet, 7 meters, inexperienced drivers found it difficult to control. So rear steering was deleted in later production, at the cost of increasing the turning cycle by 65%. And so they tested the Dingo um, in the Dieppe Raid. And so the Germans are now looking at these and inspecting them, because this is one that was captured at that was abandoned on the beaches in Dieppe. Here you can see this map is compiled and drawn by, it's a historical section of GS shows. Um, it's drawn by a historical section. This shows the entire Dieppe operation from Poos here in that area, the Royal Regiment of Canada, and other areas here where there were South Saskatchewan Regiment Commandos, number 3 and number 4, and where the main thrust was in the city of Dieppe. And of course, these are the German units here. Those are the legends there, you can see. So the eastern flank, kind of disseminating some of the stuff from the eastern flank. The assault force approached the coast of France in the early hours of the 19th, and the landing craft of the eastern sector unexpectedly encountered a small German convoy. And we mentioned this before. This was a sharp, violent sea fight, and that noise alerted, of course, all the coastal defenses, and particularly at Barneveld and Poos. With the Germans ready to man their defenses, the element of surprise was certainly lost, and this is what kind of where everything unraveled. The craft carrying number 3 commandos were scattered, and most of the unit never reached the shore. Those who did were quickly overwhelmed. One small party of 20 commandos managed to get within 180 meters of the German battery. Their accurate sniping prevented the German guns from firing on the assault ships for 2.5 vital hours before they were safely evacuated, which is awesome. At Pou's or Pais, the Royal Regiment of Canada also suffered unexpected difficulties. And so they are here. And this is Pou's right here. This is where they are as compared to the main thrust. Um, they certainly had some difficulties. The beach was extremely narrow and was commanded by lofty cliffs where German soldiers were strategically placed. And of course, these are soldiers that are on high alert as well, being tipped off. To be successful, the attackers needed surprise and darkness. They got neither. The naval landing was delayed, and as the Royal Regiment of Canada leapt ashore in the dawning light, they met violent machine gun fire from the fully alert German soldiers. Only a few men were able to get over the heavily wired seawall at the head of the beach. Those who did were unable to get back. The rest of the troops, together with three platoons of reinforcements from the Black Watch Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, were pinned on the beach by mortar and machine gun fire and were later forced to surrender. So this was all unraveling quite rather quickly within a half hour. It was impossible to evacuate them because of the German fire. Of those who landed, 200 were killed and 20 later died later of their wounds. The rest were taken prisoner. It was the heaviest toll suffered by a Canadian battalion in a single day during the entire war. Also, the failure to clear the eastern headland allowed the Germans to defend the Dieppe beaches with firepower from both sides and nullify the main frontal attack. From the western flank, the forces of the western sector attacked with some degree of surprise, in contrast to the misfortune encountered by the number 3 commandos on the east flank. The number 4 commando operation was completely successful. Units landed as planned and successfully destroyed the guns in the battery near Varengavel and then withdrew safely. At Pourville, the Canadians surprised the enemy. Initial opposition was light, as the South Saskatchewan Regiment and Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada assaulted the beaches. Resistance intensified as the Saskatchewans, supported by Cameroons, crossed the River Sea. After heavy fighting, they were stopped well short of the town of Dieppe. The main force of the Cameroons, meanwhile, pushed on towards their objective, an inland airfield, and advanced 3 kilometers before they were forced to halt as well. Both regiments then attempted to withdraw. So they lost the least. The South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada suffered heavy losses during the withdrawal. Um, initially they did not take heavy um, losses initially with the landings as the center and eastern flanks did, but they took more losses on withdrawal. The enemy fired fiercely upon the beach from dominating positions east of Pourville, and also from the high ground to the west. The landing craft, however, came in through the storm of fire with self-sacrificing bravery, and supported by a courageous rearguard. The majority of both units successfully re-embarked. Though many of the men were wounded, the rearguard itself could not be evacuated. They surrendered after they ran out of ammunition, and after further evacuation was, it was useless. So I've talked about the alerts, the warnings, and the plannings, and then I've talked about the attack overall, and now I've gone back and I am disseminating each section of the attack. So um, the main attack, the main attack that was made across the Pebble Beach in front of Dieppe was timed to take place a half hour later than the assault on its flanks. The German troops concealed in cliff tops positions and in buildings overlooking the promenade were well prepared for the Canadians. As the men of the Essex Scottish Regiment assaulted the open eastern sections, the enemy swept the beach with machine gun fire. All attempts to breach the seawall were beaten back with terrible casualties. When one small platoon managed to infiltrate the town, a message was sent back to headquarters offshore, which misleadingly led General Roberts to believe that the Essex Scottish had established themselves in the town. To support them, the reserve battalion Les Fusiliers Les Mont Royal was sent in. Like their comrades who had landed earlier, they found themselves pinned down on the beach and exposed to intense enemy fire. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry landed at the west end of the promenade opposite a large isolated casino. They were able to clear the strongly held building and the nearby pillboxes and enter the town. Some men of the battalion crossed the bullet-swept boulevard and moved into the town, where they were engaged in vicious street fighting. The Calgary Regiment also encountered unexpected obstacles, although they were supposed to land immediately after an intense air and naval bombardment. They were put ashore 10 to 15 minutes late, as mentioned before. This left the infantry without support during the first critical minutes of the attack. Then, as the tanks came ashore, they met an inferno fire and were brought to a halt. They were stopped not just by enemy guns, but also by the pebble beach and a seawall. The tanks, which managed to overcome the seawall, found their way blocked by concrete obstacles that sealed off the narrow streets. Still, the immobilized tanks continued to fight, supporting the infantry and contributing greatly to the withdrawal of many of the soldiers. The tank crews themselves became prisoners of war or died in battle. The last troops to land were part of the Royal Marine A Commando, which shared the terrible fate of the Canadians. They suffered heavy losses without being able to accomplish their mission. The raid also produced a tremendous air battle. While the Allied air forces were able to provide protection for the ships off Dieppe from the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, the cost was high. The Royal Air Force lost 106 aircraft, the highest single day total of the war. The Royal Canadian Air Force lost 13 aircraft. There are more of the Churchills there on the beach. What of carnage? Here you can see POWs being led down to encampment. Here's the carnage, more carnage on the beach. Acts of heroism, many acts of great courage took place during this raid, and 2 Canadians would earn the Victoria Cross, our country's highest awarded for military valor. Lieutenant Colonel Cecile Merritt earned the medal for courageously leading his men from the South Saskatchewan Regiment across the River Sea at Portville in the face of heavy resistance. Once the regiment could go no farther, he then led a dangerous retreat that allowed most of the men to escape back to Britain. Merritt himself was captured and spent the rest of the conflict as a prisoner of war. Honorary Captain John W. Foote, a chaplain with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, also earned a Victoria Cross. For 8 hours, he continuously braved enemy fire on the Dieppe beach to bring the wounded to first aid posts. When his own landing craft was about to leave, he intentionally stayed behind to be captured so that he could minister to the many men who were going to be taken prisoner. Here are the losses once again. 900 as 913 dead. So we had 3,367 were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. There's some 2,000 taken prisoner, and some of those guys were wounded as well. Over 2,000 wounded. An exceptional casualty rate, 68%. 1,000 British commandos lost. The 1,000 British commandos lost 247 men. The Royal Navy lost the destroyer Berkeley. We mentioned that one. It was hit, and what happened? It was hit by bombs from an FW-190, and then scuttled by Albrighton. And so the other ship had come alongside, scuttled them, and 33 landing craft suffering 550 dead and wounded. Out of all the critical lessons, Allied commanders knew that the raid was risky, but none imagined it would be such a terrible failure with so much loss of life. The planners believed the element of surprise would allow landing troops to overcome German defenders and occupy the town before withdrawing. Little thought was given to the importance of air superiority and the need for overwhelming firepower, including artillery support and from naval warships. The assaulting infantry had only light destroyers firing at the Germans from offshore but there was no battleships, they were cruisers which had heavier guns, and they were not made available for the raid, nor heavy bombers overhead. Instead, strategists put their faith in the power of tanks. Tanks had spearheaded the German blitzkrieg across Europe in 1940. 2 years later, tanks were seen as providing a crucial advantage in modern warfare. More than 2 dozen tanks would land on Dieppe's beaches beside the infantry, and this, planners said, would make all the difference. However, the 29 tanks that attempted to land, only 15 made it off the beaches and reached the town's promenade. Their guns were not powerful enough to knock out German fortifications. And that is stated by Second World War historian Terry Kopp. Army planners were still mesmerized by the vision of tanks as the decisive weapon of war, and surprise as a substitute for overwhelming firepower. Despite the failure, all the failures that happened there, it erased the idea that surprise and tanks were enough to succeed in an amphibious assault against occupied France and occupied Europe. 2 years later, the D-Day landings would be backed up by massive naval artillery support, dominance over the skies, and heavy firepower. 3 essential factors missing at Dieppe. Dieppe also made clear the difficulties of assaulting a well-defended port, as well as the need for better intelligence on beach conditions and German defenses. Better communication between infantry on the beach and commanders offshore, and the need for specialized landing craft and tanks able to overcome beach obstacles. These lessons would be implemented later in amphibious assaults in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Out of the two Victoria Cross recipients, this is one of them. We had mentioned Charles Cecil Ingersoll Merritt, John Ware Foote. The Revered John W. Foote was the first member of the Canadian Chaplain Services to be awarded the Victoria Cross. Calmly through 8 hours of a grueling battle, Reverend Foote, chaplain of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, continuously exposed himself very intense fire to help move the injured men to an aid post, saving many lives through his brave efforts. Then at the end of this ordeal, he jumped from the landing craft that would have taken him to safety. He walked courageously into the German positions to be taken prisoner, so he could minister to his fellow Canadians who were now POWs. Those who were captured faced especially harsh treatment in prisoner of war camps, and most would remain in captivity for more than 2.5 years. As the end of the war neared, many of them also had to endure forced wintertime marches as the Germans moved the prisoners away from the advancing Allied troops who otherwise could have liberated them. The Dieppe Raid also took a considerable toll on the ships and aircraft that supported the assault. August 19, 1942 saw the Allies' worst single-day losses for aircraft in the entire Second World War, with 119 of their warplanes being shot down as they tried to protect the landing force. The Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery, where 907 men died, or 913 rather, is located approximately 5 kilometers south of Dieppe, in the town of Hautet-de-Saumur. The hillside cemetery is unique in that its headstones have been placed back to back in long double rows. The Germans buried these war dead the same way they buried their own. After they liberated the region, the Allies chose not to disturb the graves. Today, the cemetery is maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Of the 944 members of the British and Allied armed forces buried at Dieppe, so 944 of them are buried there. 707 of these are Canadian. That's 707 out of the 913 that died in this raid. Most victims of the raid on Dieppe. Some of the captured, wounded raiders died in hospital in Rouen, 58 kilometers away, and 37 are buried in that city. Casualties of the raid who later died in Britain are buried mainly in Brookwood Military Cemetery in Surrey, England. This cemetery also contains the remaining of one woman, Mary Janet Clipson, a British Salvation Army Auxiliary Service officer who was killed 2 years earlier in May 1940. Canadians missing in action in the Dieppe operation are commemorated on 2 memorials in England. Members of the Army on the Brookwood Memorial and members of the RCAF on the Runnymede Memorial. Regimental memorials erected by the survivors and their comrades stand today at all the landing places on the beaches of Dieppe, Pouilly, and Pourville. Memorials pay tribute to members of the Essex Scottish Regiment, the Royal Regiment of Canada, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Fusiliers Le Mont Royal, the Calgary Regiment, the South Saskatchewan Regiment, and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada, who gave their lives in the raid. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.